Our host tonight is Michelle Millar Fisher. Michelle is currently the Ronald C. and Anita L. Warnick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts within the Contemporary Art Department at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Her work focuses on the intersections of people, power, and the material world. Michelle also sits on the Advisory Council of the Eliot School, and we're honored to have her with us tonight, along with our panelists and our respondent. Michelle?
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Abigail. Thank you to you and to the Eliot School for having me this evening and for having all of us here. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully the right screen, here we go, with our slides for the evening. So yes, I'm so excited to be hosting this really wonderful conversation, and I'm hosting it, but the speakers, the real sort of wonderful content producers of the evening tonight, are four really brilliant women with whom I'm delighted to be in conversation. I'm going to introduce them just now, and then very briefly introduce the idea of craft schools before handing it to them for their presentations. So I'm delighted that we're joined this evening by Sarah Turner, who's the president of North Bennet Street School. Sarah's bio, like everybody's bio who's speaking this evening, is incredibly impressive and also so germane to the topic that we have this evening. Sarah's worked at various different craft schools, including Cranbrook, RISD, Oregon College of Art and Craft, and SUNY New Paltz. And she also has a wonderful practice of her own as a maker. We're also joined by Dr. Mary Kay Grant, who is the president at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, or as it's affectionately known here, MassArt. She's a national leader in public higher education and has spent more than 30 years championing the arts and deepening community partnerships and civic engagement. And she's done this through a number of former positions as well, including at Bridgewater State University, at the Edward Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, at UNC Asheville, and at MCLA. I'm delighted also to be joined by the Eliot School's very own Alison Croney-Moses. She is the associate director there, and she really has my heart in terms of the way that she inspires new generations of makers and leaders in art and craft. Her work is also amazing. She has a fantastic practice as an artist too. Her museums are listed here in terms of those who hold some of the work of hers in their collection, and she's also a recipient of the USA Fellowship in Craft. And then finally, but absolutely not least, Dr. Juliana Rowen Barton, historian and curator, whose research centers on the complements of race, gender, and design. She's here in Boston at the Center for the Arts at Northeastern, and I've had the very deep pleasure of being able to work with her in a number of projects, including Designing Neighborhood. And she's worked at various different museum institutions and centers for art, architecture, craft, and design, including the Center for Architecture in New York, the Museum of Modern Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Center for Craft in Asheville in North Carolina. So tonight we're going to have a conversation about craft schools, and the wonderful speakers and then Juliana as a respondent are going to talk about craft schools here in Boston. We are incredibly blessed in this city to have a brilliant nexus of craft schools. And so we'll hear about some of the histories, the present states and the futures of MassArt, of the Eliot School and of North Bennet Street School, and indeed some of the connections that exist between these institutions within the city and beyond. I want to introduce the context for thinking about craft schools, and I'll try and do this as briefly as possible. It's hard because it's a project I'm very enthusiastic about, but I'm going to keep it to 5 minutes or less. And some of you already know, I think, a little bit about it. Back in 2020, it began as an idea for me to better understand the collection that I helped steward at the MFA. And in brief, it took me on 5 different journeys across all 48 contiguous states between 2021 and 2023. And I did it on Amtrak. I did it on the train because I felt that was more environmentally friendly. It also gave me a framework to get across what is a very large landmass. And the research question that I took with me on this project, which I called Craft Schools, Where We Make What We Inherit, was, who is the teacher that brought you to your practice? And this is me leaving. I aged a decade at least, sleeping in a sleeping bag on the train. And you can tell from these pictures, I left in September 2021. I did come back because I have a husband and a cat here in Providence, intermittently throughout this trip. But over a period of about 16 or 17 weeks, done in 5 different chunks, I came back in 2023. And I went to visit craft schools of all different shapes and sizes, as you'll see. And my research question was, who is your most important teacher? And I wanted to ask that very specifically so I could tell a wider story of craft. If I asked that question of many of the artists whose works were really at the very beginning of craft collecting at our institution, would have been a smallish group of people in many ways, because craft in many ways was defined through the lens of studio craft. Not always by any means, we're a large and broad institution, but I wanted to widen that lens and widen the answers, the possible answers to that question as much as I possibly could, so that we could tell the widest possible history of craft at the museum. So I went to various different places on these 5 different trips. I went to Berea College in Kentucky, a brilliant work study university where you graduate tuition free if you do work on campus through your 4 years. And some of that work can be in the craft program, so you can learn how to make brooms, amongst many other things. I went to the American College of Building Arts in South Carolina in Charleston, and that was set up about 20 years ago in response to the hurricanes that come through that region and the need for people to rebuild and rebuild, especially in the vein of historic preservation. So training people who can actually do those things. I went to visit individuals like Daryl Montana. You see a tiny little picture that really doesn't do his amazing Mardi Gras costumes justice. His teacher was absolutely outside of a school institution. It happened at home, and his father was the person who taught him how to make those costumes. Both of them are incredibly well known and revered for the ways in which they do so. I went to the Chicago School of Shoemaking. The founder, Sarah McIntosh, was an original back to the lander who wanted to know how to make her own pair of shoes. But when I pointed to her pinboard, which I saw the picture that you see in the right-hand corner of this slide during my interview with her, I said, "Who's that?" And she said, "First grader, eventual shoemaker." But then she said, "You know what, actually, my mom made that dress for me. She made all of my dresses. She was the first person who I learned craft from." I went to go visit Jenny Williams in Lapwai, Idaho. She teaches at the Lapwai High School that you can see in the top left, which is on reservation. And she teaches the kinds of crafts that she herself wasn't able to teach because she grew up in a moment in time where some of those traditions and ideas had been forcefully stripped from her community through assimilative boarding practices. And then all of these conversations, this trip, came back to the museum and is coming back to the museum now. The goal of the project is to have public programs like these, for a book to come out of it, but also for us to have acquisitions that come into the collection from all 48 states eventually, so that we can have these works as part of the collection exhibitions that we hold at the museum. So you'll see actually most of the works I've collected of late in our next summer collection rehang opening in July 2023. And they'll include this work by Beth Lowe and Adam John Manley, made together looking at Beth's Chinese American heritage. Tabitha Arnold, an amazing tapestry maker who trained as a painter and then went off east at PAFA in Philadelphia. Venetia Dale, Mass Art alum, who's actually going to be profiled at the ICA as part of the Foster Prize we just learned. The Berea brooms that are up on display right now in our Farrago Gallery. Deirdre Brackens' wonderful 36-foot long 4-panel tapestry, Bhumi Badepo's fantastic ceramic works that are part of the Hear Me Now Edgefield Pottery exhibition that's currently on display at the museum. So the Craft Schools project was really a way to think deeply about the collection and what contemporary craft was like in the institution in which I work. Craft is thought of expansively, yes, as part of a material-based tradition. Those things are very important, but also through the idea of craft as an ethos. As Richard Sennett says here, the idea that it cuts a far wider swath than something that is labor or materials-based, although those are important, but thinking about it through things like parenting or citizenship too. Schools, as we'll think about tonight, are both physical sites, and yes, Boston has many of them. They might be site specific, they may be residential, they may be tuition based, they may be entirely free. They might happen also in somebody's front room. They might happen in a very, very fancy building. These questions came to me as I was lucky enough in the early stages of this project to talk to some of the predecessors who'd held my job before me. I went back about 50 years and interviewed everybody who's done my job at the MFA before I have. And I wanted to ask them, why did you collect what you collected? How did you collect what you collected? What did you think craft was when you were here at the museum? And that's how I came to the question, who was the teacher that brought you to your practice? Because each one of these folks and the others who are not pictured here, they all told me they'd had a teacher, and most of us have, who'd handed down this canon, this body of knowledge that had really indelibly shaped them, even as they reached for the things that made them themselves as their own historians and curators. They had also been in the city in Boston and had connected with programs that were here in the city during that time. And so I think about, for example, the project on the right-hand side here, New American Furniture. Ned Cook was the curator, this amazing professor just here who's now at Yale and was the teacher of Glenn Adamson and Ethan Lasser, Noni Gadsden, many others. And so we think about lineage there too. But when he was in Boston, he connected with the program in artisanry, which is where I'll finish my introduction. And over 60% of the people in this catalog came from that program, either as students or teachers. So it wasn't only important the ways in which education had been handed down to us, it was the connections we made with school programs and places of craft knowledge transfer in the milieu in which we find ourselves, which for tonight's context is Boston. And so I'll end by saying the project itself builds on a nexus of craft schools that I was lucky to connect with across the country of all different shapes and sizes. BU had a really fantastic craft school, which I've been really loving delving into, called the Program in Artisanry, live between 1975 and 1985 here in Boston. And it was part of a university program, although sort of like an island unto itself as well. And it lives on in some senses with a brilliant program in artisanry at UMass Dartmouth. Fantastic professors. They're still really connected to many of the ideas of this founding. But it was one of these really interesting Boston-based programs that I don't think really could have happened anywhere else because of the rich history of craft in the city. It operated out of this building just here, which was an old car showroom, and it aimed to bring together both business teaching to teach people how to be entrepreneurs in this moment of the craft renaissance in the 70s and 80s, but also how to be free thinkers, how to be able to meld craft and art together in so many ways, as was the conversation of the moment. It brought in really fantastic teachers who were kind of highlights, luminaries of the studio craft world. And so here you see Bill Sachs and Dorian Zakai profiled in Life magazine, and less than a decade later, they would both be teaching in Boston at the program in artisanry. And it also produced some of the luminaries of the kind of second generation of studio craft makers. And I'm sorry to say that Tim Philbrick and Alphonse Mattia have both recently passed, but they, Bruce Beacon and many others have really set the tone for the collection that I have at the museum and for many other conversations that have sprung from it. They also worked in the studio craft vein, and our conversation is going to really explode out of that this evening. We're going to think certainly about studio craft, but about many, many, many other forms of contemporary making, about trade, about the expansive things that craft can be. And we'll also think about what it is to nurture craft schools, because of course, BU, I gave it the dates 75 to 85. It was only around for a decade before the program was shelved by Boston University in favor of a nursing school and scientific programs. So craft schools, it's a really large conversation, but tonight we're focusing our discussion on Boston, and I could not be more excited to introduce three fantastic presenters, each of whom will have 5 minutes, and then our wonderful respondent. I will be looking in the chat for questions, and also looking at our run of show where the questions are going to be very kindly put together by Veronica. I've asked each speaker to talk a little bit about their school, just in case people are not familiar with them. And then the question that I've asked them to respond to is, in their personal and professional experience, what are the most important ways in which Boston matters to how craft knowledge is taught or shared? And so I would love to welcome to the floor, Sarah, please take it away, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you to the Eliot School for organizing tonight, for being behind the scenes, for making it happen so easily, and for, I'm sure, being excellent conversation partners. I'm glad to be here. My name is Sarah Turner. I'm the president at a school in Boston called the North Bennet Street School. And I think for the purposes of tonight's conversation, Michelle, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I wanted to really kind of think about the ecosystem of craft that's thriving in Boston. And so what part North Bennet contributes to that. And so to do that, I'm going to probably spend a little bit more on the contemporary side of what we're doing. I'll hit the history a little bit. But this is who we are right now. This is our current class sitting outside our building. We can go to the next slide. We are a school that really situates craft next to and influenced by trade, maybe a little bit differently than schools that might situate craft next to art or design or liberal arts. North Bennet is a vocational school. Next slide. And I use that term really intentionally. It's a loaded word for a lot of people. It's full of connotations, I know. And yet, the Latin root of vocation is calling. And so that was considered a spiritual calling at one time. Now it's a little bit different. So I use it that way intentionally. I myself was trained and developed in a craft adjacent to art and design world. And so it's really thrilling to work on behalf of craft that's positioned toward employment, skill, and trade. And it influences not only what we teach, but it influences a lot of the cultural norms at this school, our orientation to careers. You can go to the next slide, towards paid work, towards client-based work, towards field work, partnerships, and community. And then you can just kind of gently go through the next 4. I think I show a couple of more programs coming up, our violin making program. So you can see things that kind of sit between craft and trade, our jewelry making and repair program, and our locksmithing program. We'll shout out to Madison Park there, and our bookbinding program. We can go to the next slide. This is what we looked like on the left in about 1920, 1930, and on the right, our founder, Pauline Agassiz Shaw. And we're different now than we were when we were founded, but you'll see the threads kind of running through. I think it's worth noting that we were founded by a woman, and we were founded as a settlement house, which there are many along the East Coast and in the Midwest. It's how North Bennet started as the North Bennet Industrial School, and it was a place that was teaching life and work skills to the waves and communities of immigrants who were arriving in Boston, and that's a long and complicated story. We're over 140 years old, and you're going to hear that in Boston. You're probably going to hear it tonight. Many places talk about being old and first as a credential, and that's certainly true for us. We're credited with being the first trade school in the United States. Let's see, we'll go to the next school. Next slide, I mean. We've always been in the North End, and that is an ecosystem unto itself, full of early American history. If you go to the next slide. And those are some early images, programs for youth, programs for adults, everything from things we think of as craft and trade to things that we might think of as like home economics, for instance. And the next slide. So we're full of relationships to early American history. Those are early site in the North End. You can see the Old North Church in the back. Next slide. Paul Revere's house is right down the street from us. That's where we are. So those of you who are not from Boston or not familiar with Boston geography, we sit right out there in the North End, surrounded by water, essentially. Next slide. As I said, Old North Church, of one if by land, two if by sea fame, is right down the street. It's where we hold our graduation. Paul Revere on that monument there, his home is down the street from where we are. Silversmith, as you know, among other things. And in the North End, which is a very, right now, a proudly Italian neighborhood and a truly local community and tourist destination where Italian is spoken on the street, in the shops, and bakeries only take cash. So it's a little bit about the North End and our site. Because we're talking about Boston, next slide, I'll just mention that we're across the street from the Greenway. And the Greenway has really been formative in the city of Boston, formative for North Bennet Street School, certainly during the Big Dig in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, went on for about 2 decades. And also right now, as Boston rethinks how it's coming back to life as a city post-pandemic, I think the Greenway is going to be essential to that, particularly as we think about downtown, because the reasons for being downtown are changing. Now, I also want to put this slide on the right because we sit right adjacent to City Hall, essentially. And that means a lot, I think, to be right down there where governing is happening. And we had the opportunity to tune the mayor's piano. So that is one of our students tuning piano in her office. And you see that it's looking right out over downtown Boston and one of Boston's most beautiful brutalist buildings, in my opinion. That's a little bit about local and Boston and context when you think about situating us. And then I'll just close with a couple of images of thinking about kind of what we do best, which is taking our skills into communities on projects both big and small to build, repair, restore, whether that's instruments or buildings or furniture, and to use those projects to train people. We can go to the next slide. An image of repair project that our preservation carpentry students worked on shortly as the pandemic was kind of easing a little bit. And then I think with our last slide, we do this because we really want to give room for the wide variety of intelligence that exists within people, their experience, their personality, material and technical intelligence, thinking about the ways that their goals will find skills-based usefulness for themselves and for their lives and for their fields. So that's a little bit about North Bennet.
Sarah, thank you so very much. That was perfect. Did I cut you off before you were finished, or was that the
No.
right? Fantastic. That was wonderful. Thank you. I love that overview of the very specific place that you are in Boston. I have questions for you to come back to, but for now, I'm going to welcome Dr. Grant. Thank you so much for being with us, and I offer you the floor, and I'll advance the slide.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Sarah. It's really interesting every time as we've been talking about this, I learn more about these wonderful institutions that we get to partner with and work with. And please, I extend my thanks to the Eliot Street School as well. So, again, starting with some of the history, as Michelle asked, MassArt is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. We are the only independent public college of art and design in the country. And we think that is an incredible strength that we have and we bring to the education field. So again, I'm going to just move through some slides. Michelle, thanks for driving. So the next slide shows us at our very early day when we were founded. Our origins come from 1870, which was the Drawing Act, a piece of legislation in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that determined that there was a need for people, young men and women across the Commonwealth, to learn how to draw, to teach drawing, and be ready for the changing economy as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So it was really about positioning Massachusetts to be successful on many different fronts. And at the very beginning of the MassArt story, we actually had a traveling museum in 1871 that went across the Commonwealth showing artifacts of drawing. That was not a very sustainable approach. So the traveling museum came home and it became the origin of the first library of mass art. So in 1873, we had our very first class begin. And in 1876, we graduated 64 individuals who went out into the community to begin to teach drawing. So the next slide is going to show you a little bit more contemporary mass art. We have 18 majors, and presently we have about 2,000 students, undergraduate and graduates programs. And so we offer a wide range of programs from history of art to fine arts to a range of programs more traditionally associated with the crafts. So I'm going to move through those. So an incredible program in ceramics, glass blowing, glass making. As a matter of fact, at our next foundation meeting, we're going to have all the foundation board members learn how to blow a little glass and build a community at the same time. Jewelry and sculpting. And I noted that Emily Cobb is on this call tonight, and we've had a wonderful partnership between our jewelry program and the North Bennet Street School, as well as through some of our other sculpture programs. Rick and Laura Brown have a long history. Great to have them on the call tonight. So lots of intersections. Our furniture making program, furniture design. Recently, we've had a spectacular program, which I think shows the way MassArt connects to our community, where students worked with faculty members around reclaiming woods from some forests in Western Mass, built a beautiful table. The next slide shows some of the wood making, and are returning that table to the conference room of one of the DCR parks. So just really how we're connecting with our community out into the community. We have a program in fibers as well, which is shown on the next slide. And that is connected with our fashion program. So we're looking at how, even in our own institution, we're doing more deliberate and intentional connections with a significant emphasis on sustainability. That's a piece of work that's at the heart of all the educational programs that are happening now at MassArt. As we think about present day, and the next slide will show that as we look at the next generation of students coming into MassArt, we're particularly engaged in our community. And I think that's a critical component of being a public higher education institution. We have a responsibility not only to be in the community, but to be of the community. So one of the programs in which we're partnering with the Boston Public Schools to really engage the next generation of makers, leaders, designers, educators, teachers in the field of art and design is through our Artward Bound program, which celebrates 10 years in the next couple of weeks. And we're working within every one of the Boston Public Schools. And it's a 4-year program, and it has a significant rate of retention of of students who go on to graduate, and then are heading into art and design programs, continuing to diversify and fill the pipeline of talent. We also engage in the community, and you may have seen the next slide, this our fabulous little Spark the Artmobile around Boston neighborhoods. And during the pandemic in particular, it really brought mass art into the community, bringing out supplies for making, engaging, the ability for the communities to connect in some very powerful ways. And so Spark the Artmobile brings our Center for Art and Community Partnership, which engages our students, our faculty, our staff with partners in the neighborhood. So the next few slides show some just ways in which we engage. So community initiatives. Our Grove Hall and Color is a summer event we do in partnership with neighborhood groups where we're bringing together folks from all across the craft spectrum, the design spectrum, and everybody on this day can learn how to make and learn how to work together. The next slide shows one of the initiatives within our architecture program, which is our Community Build initiative. And through Community Build, our architecture students and faculty are working every summer on a project. It could be from a park to a community garden. In this case, this is a project that is being finished up, which is a butterfly pavilion in Newton. And it has been done in partnership with a neighborhood group, the city, our students. And so our students get the opportunity to put into practice what they're learning and to really look at art and architecture through the lens of social justice. And so this is a really interesting and unique aspect to how the mass art education is continuing to evolve. And it continues to evolve. And the next slide will show one of the ways in which we're engaging community is through our museum. So at Mass College of Art and Design, we have our Mass Art Museum, and several of my colleagues who are on this panel tonight actually all came together a few months ago around one of our exhibitions called Designing Motherhood, which took a look at the intersection of public policy, design, craft, history, issues of social justice and equity and inclusion. And so I think when we think about what does a higher education institution bring to the discussion, bring to the centering of craft and education, we bring along research components, the historical pieces of this up that help inform, and then the expression of craft is a way to make it come to life in some very powerful ways. So the museum has been one way in which mass art has come out into the community and the community into mass art. So this is an exquisite sculpture that was in place for for the first 2 years because we opened in 2020. As you may recall, 2020 also brought us all the pandemic. And so we were open for about a month and then we shut down and like everyone else are in the process of reopening. So the next slide also shows family programs that we have because we really believe it's important to make art and design accessible, to have everyone see themselves possibly in a museum space. So MAM is a free and open museum to anyone who comes through the doors. And the next slide shows what I think is really just great joy, where we're able to bring mass art literally onto Huntington Ave, engaging with our community and bringing folks in. And when we think about on the next slide, physical building today, we have had several physical locations throughout the city. We began in Pemberton Square, right outside the State House, moved to Newbury Street. We had a location around the corner from our present home now, which is on Huntington Ave. And we have 3 residential halls. We have students who come to us from across the Commonwealth, the New England areas, across the country, and the world. And we have a legacy of graduates within the field doing absolutely remarkable work. And there are all kinds of bragging points that I could say about our graduates, but I will tell you that the seedlings of mass art, as defined in the Drawing Act, actually produced the first headmaster of RISD, the first principal of RIT, and the first director of Pratt Institute. So when we think about moving out and spreading art and design education across the Commonwealth and the country, mass art has been a center of excellence and innovation at that for 150 years. And I would invite everyone to connect with us during this year. There's a lot going on. You will see more of us as we're pushing out into the community and opening up our doors wide to all who want to come through. So, Michelle, that's just a quick snapshot of who we are and what we're doing. There's a lot more, but it's a tremendous legacy and a brilliant future ahead. And craft is essential to the mission of mass art.
Dr. Grant, I loved that presentation and I loved it for many reasons, but one of the things I learned when I came to do the exhibition at Mass Art is Mass Art alums do not play. They are very proud to come from Mass Art, and I can see some of them already in the chat here. So it's really nice to see the love coming through in the questions. I can also see already some questions coming through, and I really welcome you as the audience, as you're thinking about questions, as our wonderful speakers are presenting, get them in there and I'll make sure that we attend to them. I'll save them all until we've had our presentations. And I think you may have missed it, but you can see it now that you've stopped presenting, Dr. Grant, that Amy Hitchcock, it was her grandmother in the first Mass Art pic that you shared. So we have somebody who actually recognized somebody in one of those historical pictures. Anyhow, I will pass the floor now to Alison Croney Moses, and Alison's going to tell us a little bit about her practice, but also her practice at the Eliot School. So Alison, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Michelle, for moderating. Thank you everyone for saying yes when I asked to be part of this, because I thought the conversation would be a rich one. So I'm really happy to be here tonight. Alison Croney Moses, I'm the Associate Director at the Eliot School of Fine and Applied Arts, with a mission to inspire lifelong learning in craft and creativity for all. Slide, please. So I want to give a little historical context to the work at the Eliot School. It was made possible by the research from Emma Thomas in our 340th birthday. The Eliot School was founded in 1676 as a grammar school. The school was named after John Eliot, who deeded 75 acres to the organization. John Eliot is known for establishing praying towns and has had a complicated and violent impact, specifically on Indigenous communities. We're in the process of investigating that past and making steps towards a better future. Abigail mentioned that in the land acknowledgement earlier. Excuse me. By the 1890s, the Eliot School was shaped by neighbors Robert and Ellen Swallow Richards, both coming from MIT. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Eliot School invested in a long-term experimentation to shift the role craft, trade, and manual arts have in our society. So after some research by visiting craft schools, including North Bennet Street School, trade school, they developed a curriculum that integrated craft and trade education side by side with academics, with the goal of using our hands to spark a thirst for learning, something that still is true today. These classes were available to both the working class as well as folks who had more leisurely time to spend. The curriculum, think about the woodworking curriculum, and even, well, the woodworking curriculum in particular was first piloted in the partner schools through Boston Public Schools, then expanded to all Boston Public Schools and then throughout the country. That expansion including both woodworking and home economics, and included teaching both boys and girls. Eliot School then focused on developing curriculum for teachers to teach this working with your hands, to have a thirst for learning, which was handed over to the Massachusetts Normal Art School, which is now Mass Arts. We once again established partnerships with public schools in the early 2000s with the rise of college readiness and the decline of arts in public schools. Slide, please. So today we send teaching artists into schools and community sites that have limited access to art and craft education. We have a school building in Jamaica Plain, where these pictures are from, where all ages come to learn a variety of art and craft mediums. We recently launched our adult partnerships, bringing programming to adults throughout Boston. Slide, please. And we have an intensive creative youth development program called Teen Bridge that supports young people's artistic, personal, and professional skills and provides employment opportunities. These young people each summer collaborate with a Boston-based artist to create a public work of art. You can check out the recently installed mural at the English High School outside by their track. That was installed by our teen artists in collaboration with Go5 and Take One. I just want to do a shout out to Craig Bailey, who's in the audience, for taking pretty much all these photos, I'm pretty sure. And you can check back at our website for the release of our public programming for 2023 for the artists in residence, Feda Eid in the Boston Public Libraries. And their work will be investigating the theme of Made in the USA. Slide, please. So just a little quick note on my own work. In addition to the work at the Eliot School, I'm an artist and craftsperson. My work is in craft institutions and art spaces blend together, and I prioritize expanding our view of craft. Where does it show up? How does it show up? Who has access? And the value that we place on craft. I'm doing this in my personal art practice by crafting objects and experiences that embody collective grief, joy, care, and repair. This can be seen this Friday at Piano Craft Gallery at the opening for the Unadulterated Black Joy. It's an exhibition I'm curating and in, so it's a lot. Slide, please. So Boston has a long written history, right? An oral history. And Boston is also well known for its tech and medical industries. And we see a focus on math and science and K through 12 education, all well scaffolded so we can pursue careers in these fields. So I'm challenging ourselves to think about pathways when we talk specifically about Boston. And this is a little image from our biennial report that should have hit a lot of folks' mailbox in the past couple of weeks. And so each organization here represents parts of this long history and a unique focus. North Bennet Street School focuses on the trades, Mass Art on public college education focused on art and craft, Eliot School on manual arts to spark that thirst for learning. So we, along with other craft and even government institutions, have a responsibility in my mind to do two things: articulate the value of making with our hands and creative problem solving that we all know shows up throughout every industry as well as the arts. And then another responsibility we have is to identify, build, and support the pathways, hence the slide, the pathways for folks to access the manual arts, craft, trade, whatever you want to call it. I think it's a large kind of framework that includes, it's focused on making with our hands and shaping the spaces around us. So making sure that folks have the pathways to access, as well as supporting those young folks, even as young as 3 and 4-year-olds, all the way up through their careers, so they can find a pathway to pursue in any industry that they want, including art and craft in the trades. I've taught middle school students years ago now who, when I stepped into the classroom, they couldn't read a ruler. I gave them scissors and they couldn't hold scissors properly. If we don't work together to support art and craft in Boston and then beyond, I don't know how we can expect these young folks to design the clothes that we make, the buildings that we live in, or even our cities. Slide, please. And a lot of this came up in my thinking for this presentation, came up in a tour that I just did that I took at North Bennet Street School to just see how each organization that's here really helps to shape a component of how our city really grapples with craft and how we access it. So these slides at the Eliot School, we're thinking it through the lens of pathways. And so these are from our biennial report. And I just want to highlight that this is Isaac, who is a young person who went through our Teen Bridge program and is now at UMass Boston and figuring out his career pathway, right? Slide, please. And this one's Walker, who's at a local school, John F. Kennedy School, who had a woodworking program, participated in a woodworking program last year when he was in kindergarten. This year is in first grade. Slide, please. I think there's another one. So who knows what Walker or his classmates will grow up to be, but we know that they all know how to hold a hammer. They all were excited to show up at school when working class was happening. They know, their bodies actually know kinetic energy and friction as they push that saw through those wood fibers. Their body knows eye-hand coordination and gravity as they swung that hammer and try to hit the nail and not their thumb. These skills will be essential in whatever they pursue for careers, and they'll have the excitement and that thirst for learning that happens when you work through your hands. That's all I have. Thanks.
Alison, that was wonderful. Thank you so very much. I love this picture, and I cannot wait to talk a little bit more about the ways in which craft schools in Boston and also beyond are teaching across different ages, across different ability levels, across different interests, as well as across different media. Before I do that though, and I can see again, great questions coming up in the chat, which I can't wait to get to, I'm going to invite Juliana Rowen Barton to the floor, and she's going to offer a response to some of the things that we've begun talking about and hopefully whet our appetites for a really good conversation. So Juliana has a few slides. I'm going to welcome her to give her response, and then I'll X out of the PowerPoint so that we can see each other and really engage in some good questions. I have some lined up, but I'm also really excited to dive into those that you're putting in the chat just now. So Juliana, thank you so much for being with us, and I will move to your slides.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and to Michelle and Alison, who invited me to be here. I was asked to be here because I'm trained as a historian. I'm trained as an architectural historian, and the thought was maybe I could impart some of that in a response to this conversation, and I will try to do so. And I will try to keep it brief so that we can move to the more exciting questions. So earlier this week, I was having a conversation with an architecture colleague of mine at Northeastern University. I'm the director of the Center for the Arts there. And we were talking about the architect Julia Morgan. Northeastern has just acquired Mills College, which is in Oakland, and Julia Morgan designed some of the original buildings as well as the campanile, which withstood the San Francisco earthquake and fire at the beginning of the 20th century, which I learned in this obituary, which was published in 2019 in the New York Times. I knew none of that when I went through my undergraduate, nor my graduate or PhD coursework in art history. I never learned about Julia Morgan or many of her peers, I would say female peers, but she's the first woman to graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and was a pioneering female architect of her generation. And as I talked with this colleague about who's creating an architecture course at Mills, who wants to be able to integrate the incredible building, the living history of Julia Morgan, I was even more struck and honestly quite distraught that I had not been taught this history myself. This is exactly the kind of figure and narratives that I wanted to learn while I was learning to write and think about history, the histories of craft, history of architecture, histories of art. And so that was also a conversation. You can go to the next slide, Michelle. That's the cover of the obituary, which, by the way, was part of a series that the Times did called Overlooked. Julia Morgan didn't get an obituary when she died either. You're seeing a photo of her at her studio in Paris when she was at the École des Beaux-Arts, and just the kicker of the wonderful obituary, which was written by Alexandra Lang, was I didn't know her story. I didn't learn about her in school, and I hope that will never happen again, which really summed up the way that I felt about her when I learned about her as well. So for me, you can go to the next slide, Michelle, that had me thinking a lot about where we learn history, whose history we learn from what. And I loved that all of the presentations today shared a piece of the history from the schools where they had come from and the histories around Boston. Sarah, I love the ways in which you talked about histories in Boston as the who's first and who's what. I have it written down. First and oldest. And I was trained in Philadelphia, where we have the same claims, many of them. And so what I also have been thinking about is that the same history is not necessarily relevant for mass art as it is for North Bennet Street School, as it is for the Eliot School. There are different audiences, they're training at different levels, they're training for different purposes. So that led me to this idea of what is culturally appropriate education for craft. I take the term culturally appropriate care from the project that Michelle and I work on with some colleagues, including Alison, that was at Mass Art, called Designing Motherhood. You're seeing a photo here of some direct service workers in Philadelphia from the Maternity Care Coalition, who have been providing culturally appropriate care to Philadelphia residents, to young children, to parents, that thinks about what they need specifically. So they serve low-income communities, immigrant communities, and I want to think about what that means in craft situations or in education around craft and art as well. That's something that I have been thinking through. There are the histories of the institutions we work with or work in, but also the histories that those institutions share or impart upon us. And for the sake of time, I'm going to leave it there. But hopefully that just gets things going a little bit. And I know Michelle has lots of other questions. That leads me to lineages, which I know Michelle will talk about, and lots of other things. But thank you all for joining me in this conversation.
Fantastic. Juliana, thank you so much. Thank you to all four speakers. They were absolutely brilliant. I have some questions that I've prepared, and so I'm going to put one out there, but I'm going to then really keep an eye on the chat, and I would love to, I'll go back and take a look at people's questions that have come in already, and I'm really galvanized and excited for the brain trust that's in the room this evening to give us their questions so that we can make sure that they get answered. I'm just so struck though, Juliana. I also am a lapsed architectural historian, and when we talk about first and oldest, Julia Morgan absolutely was the first, and I cannot believe she did not get a New York Times obit in her own time. So that leads me to my very first question. Thinking about that term culturally appropriate education, I'd like to invite all of our speakers, so 3 speakers and respondent this evening. As is my way, I'm going to try and sandwich 3 questions into one. So you can pick whichever part of the question that you prefer. But it struck me, I'd love us to articulate, and you started us off there, Juliana, the very obvious question, but I'd love to hear it in your own words again. Why is it important for us to engage with questions about who teaches craft? Why are we talking about craft schools rather than the artists who come out of these schools, or the anything else to do with the artistic output, the movements from these schools, the artworks themselves that have come out of these spaces? Why talk about schools? And which histories are we telling right now? I think about the fact that you're in a school, Alison, that's 343 years old. You've got a lot of histories that you can tell. So which ones are you picking out now? And the third part of the question is, how many of your students and teachers know these histories? How many of them are super fluent in understanding the various layers of history that they come into in these spaces every day? And how do they feel about those histories? Because, you know, each of us has a different relationship to history built from our own social vocations and experiences. So I'll just reiterate that again. Why are we talking about schools in the first place? Which histories are we talking about when we talk about these schools? Because you all are actively, you know, presenting these histories in your jobs every day. And how many of your students and faculty know these histories? How are we utilizing these as part of the teaching that we do in each of the places in which you gather? And I count you among that, Juliana, because you're at Northeastern. And so like, how does that show up in your work? So just for the sake of keeping conversation going, I'll call on people until we start getting the questions from the chat going as well. So Sarah, maybe I can turn to you first. And you can pick, each of you can pick one of the questions if you prefer. You don't have to answer all 3 at once.
Well, I was taking notes while you were talking so I could keep track. I mean, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about why it matters who teaches, and also why we're talking about schools and not just individuals. And because I love the project of the school. You know, I was trained as a maker, and I'm incredibly satisfied to be working as an educational leader, because they're complicated and they're messy and they're hard and they're relational and all of those things. So when I think about the question of like who's teaching and why it matters, I think we know really, really well, I hope at this point, that representation matters, and who our students see as role models and who they see as possibilities, what fields they see as possibilities for themselves, that they would see themselves and their background and their identity and their experience reflected in their mentors. We know that matters. I think the thing that I'm thinking about these days is who teaches it and where the skill and craft goes, because it doesn't end at the student, it doesn't end at the school, it goes somewhere else. And for us, it goes into service and into the community. It goes into tuning people's pianos in their homes. It goes into fixing their garages. It goes into binding books in a library. And so I think we're thinking a lot about that whole cycle of like, who teaches can mean who trains and who follows, which can mean who applies that skill in the world. And because craft is so connected to community, it means that it helps determine where that skill will go in the community. Like our students come to us And then a lot of times they go back to the community from which they came with that set of skills. So if we're not really actively engaged in a broad range of communities, we'll limit where that skill or that resource will go later. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about this whole cycle of who teaches and what it perpetuates for where skill, talent, knowledge, expertise, all those things gets applied later.
Michelle, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Juliana. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, Sarah, I really like the cyclical and perhaps even like web-like or network, because I can imagine that it doesn't complete one circle. Someone might come and do something and then it turns into another circle and you get a flower or something like that. But to me, that sounds like a more compelling analogy for what's often talked about in educational contexts as pipeline issues, the pipeline. And a pipeline is so linear of getting someone from point A to point B, but thinking about these as cycles and thinking about starting with the teacher and not necessarily with the student is such a lovely way of thinking about kind of, I don't want to say solving, because that's perhaps too onerous on us, but addressing some of these questions. So I really appreciate that cyclical thinking.
Absolutely. Dr. Grant, Alison, your thoughts?
Yeah, when I think this is a great question, Michelle, and, I think about the school, I think about the institution, because I think, at the founding of Mass Art, in the DNA of the place is a mission of access and inclusion and opportunity. And we have to work so very hard. We can never take that for granted. And I think about, I look at it in the context of the present times, what's happening across the country in terms of just an assault on certain sectors of public higher education. And I believe even more firmly of the mission and the matter and the time of this institution, because, we were created for a purpose, and that purpose continues. The ability, the necessity of innovation, the necessity of creativity, the necessity of teaching students who learn in a range of different ways, and having such a place where anyone can see themselves there. So who teaches also matters, because we need to make sure we're representing so that students who are coming from a range of backgrounds can see that this is indeed their place. And that we have a responsibility and a commitment to ensure that there is this kind of public education that supports a life of creativity, innovation, opportunity, difference making, creating and connecting cultures. So I think that the mission of Mass Art and the school itself has never been more important. We are on the front edge of really needing to lead in these extraordinarily challenging times. So I think about the school all the time. And then when I go in those doors, wherever those doors may be, whether it's or Huntington Ave, in those doors is extraordinary talent that is being developed, that has come through the door already in great shape. And we have a chance to just pull that together in ways that then go back out into the community. To Sarah's point, it's about going back out and continuing to engage and invest and shape a better future, because too much is at stake. So the learning, the access, the opportunity, the creativity, all those things that have been there since the beginning are what I think about every day. And how do we ensure that this place is there for the next 150 years? Because we are distinct in the landscape of public higher education. And I think that, so we're that front door, and then the door that goes out to so many other places. So I'm surrounded by brilliant individuals every day that are making a difference. This institution has a rich history that has made a profound difference.
I want to come back to, thank you for that, Dr. Grant. I want to come back to that notion of access in a second, because both you and Sarah touched upon that, and certainly so did you too, Juliana, and what you said. But before I do, Alison, any thoughts in terms of the question I asked about why we're talking about craft schools? I mean, I think about the Eliot School, and again, got 343 years of history, or if I got that number right, yeah, 343 years, right? And so I mean, you have to grapple with quite a few of those histories. You're thinking through that right now. I know you and Abigail and many others at the Eliot School are really thinking about how those histories, show up in the lives of your students, the lives of your teachers, the folks who come and interface with the Eliot School. And so, yeah, can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that?
Yeah, and it's going to be kind of muddled. And I love how you always pack in multiple questions that encourages my
Really
muddled
polite way of putting
responses.
it, Alison.
So just to say, I think all three institutions that are here are about access in the founding of it, in the shaping of how like the mission was written. It's about access, but access to a structured institution that is shaped by the history of this country, right? So like it's limiting on the foundation of what we're talking about, access to what, because the country is not accessible. Like how it's structured. So that's one thing that just kind of I want to pull out and just acknowledge. And then I think about this idea of history, and I was like, let's get us all together to have this conversation. I am not a historian, and my brain doesn't work that way. And I now introduce myself to people and say, I'm not going to remember your name because I actually remember in feelings. I will remember the feeling of a moment. And I remember this, I went to Rhode Island School of Design, and they teach you, they like get you excited about the material you're engaged in making. I'm hooked. Furniture, woodworking, let's do this. And then they take me into a classroom to learn the history of furniture. And let me tell you, I fell asleep in like 95% of the classes in an embarrassing way. John Dunnigan, I am so sorry. But it's this moment of like, first of all, what they were showing was interesting in some surface way, but I felt no like emotional connection to the work. And now, and I always just thought something was wrong with me. And like my brain does work differently. Now I understand that. But I also understand that actually like there's a whole craft that was purposely not documented that built craft of our country. Enslaved folks like built our country through the physical objects. And that's not documented in the way that gives credit to that and speaks about it as a part of our woven history that is written. There is an oral history that I think is also has been gutted in many ways of what we're allowed to share and talk about. And I can't even approach Indigenous experiences and engagement in craft because I'm still trying to grapple with my own like being rooted in the craft histories. So to get back to the original 3-part question, I think like craft schools, when I think back, and I remember having a conversation during the pandemic with John Dunnigan from RISD and thinking about how they do this differently and recognizing that like it's like a 5-year, 6-year, 7-year degree if you do everything. And that tension of if you would bring in other perspectives in an institution of craft, there's a feeling of having to lose something. And so I have no solutions but to recognize that, thank God, institutions are thinking about that tension, recognizing that it exists, even if there's no solutions at the current moment, other than we keep trying to shift it. But because I think like our responsibility is to think about the structure of the spaces we create, who's represented there, the content of it, what is that recognizing, and the absence, what is that not recognizing? And so that's the responsibility that we have to shift it. And I have so many other thoughts, but I'm going to stop there because it just keeps going.
I'm going to come back for your other thoughts shortly, Alison. What I want to do is return or come back to that question of access. And Dara, you beat me to it with a chef's kiss of a question in the chat just there. So I'm going to read yours and add my little bit to it. But Dara is saying, I'd love to hear which efforts to expand access each panelist feels has been most effective at their institution. And I want to change that question a little bit, because often when I ask somebody about that as it relates to their institution, they'll tell me the things that have been really successful. And I'd love actually to ask the part of the question, which are the things you're really grappling with, you don't have a great answer for, that keep you up in the middle of the night, that you think about while you're taking a shower in the morning? Which are the questions about access that relate to maybe tuition costs? Cost is relative for everybody. Tuition, is very rare that an educational experience in this country is free. I come from Scotland, where my entire education right through graduate school was completely free, which is very important for me because I was a first generation student. Not so in the US. Education costs here in so many ways. But we've talked about tuition, access, connecting with communities in the sort of, I love that idea of a flower, Juliana. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the parts of access that really, that really seem still like knotty issues to you, rather than the things you've solved and you've got a great answer for. And so anybody, if you, go for it, Sarah. Thank you.
Well, I mean, this is partly I'll just say the same one you said, which is really cost of education. It is an extremely thorny issue. And I partly because, Alison talked about the structures and conventions that we inherit when we inherit our institutions, that our institutions were grown out of, and private education in this country. I certainly have not solved that tension of private education. When I also think about a really delicate balancing act between being a private tuition-based school that wants to keep costs in check for students, wants to increase financial aid, and I would say that is the boldest move North Bennet has done, is holding tuition flat and raising financial aid substantially. Those are bold moves, but it doesn't change things structurally. And I think at the same time, I'm very, very mindful. What keeps me awake at night is I also need to create a place that's a competitive employer that pays fairly and good benefits and makes it possible to work and live in an expensive city. And I have to balance that. We have to balance that when we're a revenue-based institution, and the revenue is partly based on the cost of classes and study. So that's just a very real conundrum. And then philanthropy comes in, and I will say Boston is an incredibly generous city. And the amount of philanthropic dollars in this city and the generosity and foresight and broad-mindedness of it is remarkable. And it's still is underpinned by huge wealth inequities. So that's the thing that I really struggle with about access. And I think I'd love to talk about the successes, but you asked about the challenges, so I'll stop there.
I'm going to come back for the successes because I really want to celebrate those too. But I really appreciate the vulnerability and sharing some of the things that are harder to think about. And actually, Shane in the chat, who I know thinks about this themselves as well at the Baltimore Jewelry Center, is asking these same questions about the pressure on schools to monetize, to increase enrollment, to really think about the ways in which you can sort of expand and capitalize on education. Dr. Grant, Alison, Juliana, any thoughts you have?
Yeah, again, I come back to the unique nature of Mass Art, Mass College of Art and Design as a public institution, because you do not need to go to a private school and break the bank. And that's part of it. We in Massachusetts, we have a bias towards private higher education because we're surrounded, with all due respect to colleagues on this call, by enormously wonderful private institutions. Mass Art, when we compare ourselves with private institutions across the country, we are an extraordinary value, even for out-of-state students. And so, we have to keep working with the legislature to ensure that there's an investment in Mass Art. We work on philanthropy around scholarships, because even at the price where I can say here comfortably, it's reasonable. My definition of reasonable, and a first-generation student who without college experience may not seem the case. So we have to work very hard on scholarship funding so that students are not deterred. The other thing that we've worked really hard on doing, we have lowered in the last, I think, 5 to 7 years with fundraising efforts, we have lowered our loan indebtedness by 37%. So Mass College of Art and Design now has the lowest level of student debt out of any of the 9 state universities. That is something else for an art and design school. So we have prioritized supporting that level of access, the financial access. We have set up emergency funds so that if a student is at one of those backbreaking moments that we often don't know about, it could be a small thing, I need supplies for my next project, or a big thing, like my car broke down and I can't afford to get to school, or we have resources to help students with that so that they don't stop. Because once a student stops, it's harder to begin. So but that keeps me up at night, because I worry about the messages of also what you can do with an art and design education, that we're running the risk of excluding individuals when you can have an extraordinarily engaged and productive career in a life that's rich in so many ways. So that's what I worry about, Michelle. But the access piece financially, we have to keep working at it, and we have to ensure that this institution has the support it needs, because we really are that doorway. I can say that unequivocally and with great pride, but we can't take anything for granted. And I worry about who are we missing? Who doesn't know that they can be here?
I love the two things really touched me there, Dr. A couple of things did. In my first year of college, my mom had a brain hemorrhage. I was the eldest in my family, and I almost didn't finish or carry on with university. But somebody, somewhere on the faculty, sent me $500 through a program, £500, changed my life. I could pay for groceries over a summer when my mom couldn't work, and I did go back to university in my second year. And so and it didn't have to be monetary necessarily. I needed somebody to also say, come back to school. And that really changed things. I also came from a country where it was free to go to school. And I remember coming here and meeting people as a 22-year-old and saying, how much did you have to pay to go to school? And it was either they paid and they went into debt. Our generation, I think, is probably the greatest in debt. I think there's a much more current conversation now for many people now considering higher education. But I think it's in shifting that paradigm. We expect somehow education to be incredibly expensive here in this country a lot of the time, whereas the reverse is true in the United Kingdom. When the Tories tried to and successfully did include or introduce tuition for many of the universities across the United Kingdom, there were riots. And I often think, why aren't we rioting? Why aren't we like tipping things upside down because of the ways in which we are expected here to pay for education rather than it being seen as more of a human right, and especially in the areas that everybody on the screen is teaching. I don't want to miss the opportunity for Alison or Juliana to add to this question, but if you don't feel a burning desire to, I can also add to, I can ask another question either from my list or from the chat.
Well, I just want to add that there is a real tension in what Sarah mentioned, that there is accessible education. And I just got the rundown from North Bennet Street School, and I'm like, I want to sign up for a certificate program. And you see that at Mass Art, but there's a real, that tension of like, how do we pay instructors? Like, I'm an adjunct professor at Mass Art.
Yeah.
You know, it's intense to be able to make it to survive. I have 2 kids. I'm now live in Rosendale. I walked out of RISD with $90,000 of school debt, probably 95. I still had that 90 something if it weren't for that waiver that just released, and it was forgiven after a significant amount of time of working for nonprofits and all of the things. So just to recognize like the voice that's not in the, well, I guess it's in the room through me, of like the teacher, the artist, that's where, like, if we make it accessible in our current society, dealing with all of the things and trying to be a competitive employer, it is really difficult. Someone is feeling the tension. Yeah. And just recognizing even like healthcare for young people, like a kid, you know, a young person at Mass Art had a concussion, and I had to figure out how to navigate that and like advocate for them to take care of themselves in our society. That what you're talking about, Michelle, doesn't value education and doesn't value healthcare. So those are the moments that the individual often end up navigating and absorbing. And then the question is always like, what are craft institutions? What are we responsible for as we shape this space? And I so appreciate those 2 perspectives.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely correct. I think back to being an adjunct at CUNY, and I earned very, very little. And then being an adjunct in non-state schools and being able to do things like have healthcare. And so that tension that you raised, Sarah, is a really important one, because we need to take care of teachers. We need to value what they are teaching, and we need to make sure that they are around for the long term. Which actually brings me to the question that I'd love all 4 of you to answer. And while you answer it, I'm going to be looking through the chat for sort of a final quick fire round from the audience. So if you have questions that are burning, please get them in there, because I will make sure to go through very quickly. The Craft Schools project, every single state, every single place, the hundreds and hundreds of people that I got to meet, every single time I started the conversation with them, I said, could you tell me about the teacher who brought you to your practice? Who was the teacher who was kind of transformative for you? Lots of people had lots of different answers. Sometimes those people were found in school, sometimes way outside them. Sometimes there were more than one. That was often the case. But I'm wondering if you could briefly, each of you, talk about a teacher that was really important for you and your practice. And so maybe Juliana, I'll start with you.
Oh, I thought you were going to end with me.
No, you go first.
Okay, well, there are 2 that immediately come to mind. The first is Carmen Higginbotham, who is now the dean of the VCU School of the Arts. She was an art history professor who I had in college, and I did not know until much later in my life how important it was that I had a Black woman who was an art history professor, who was tenure track and raising a family and a critical thinker in so many ways. It took me probably a decade out from that to realize, I mean, I still text with her and we are still close and all of that, but the impact beyond, I've never studied what she studied. Her mentorship was much broader than that. But that in retrospect, it was having a Black woman to look up to in a way that I had not before in the educational settings that was incredibly important. And then Michelle and I share another really important teacher. Juliet Kinchin was the curator of design, modern design at the Museum of Modern Art, where I was an intern a very long time ago, working with her on an exhibition. And she is very much the reason I'm doing what I'm doing. I wrote my dissertation based on the topic of that exhibition. I'm a curator because of the 10 weeks I spent with her and learning that I could study Tupperware and it would be a valuable contribution to society somewhere out there. And Juliet is also very much the reason I met Michelle. We bonded within the first 5 minutes of meeting each other, that we had this shared person and we're part of this shared lineage, and it makes conversing and working together that much more meaningful to share our history with JK. Juliet is a very, very important figure in both of our lives.
Yeah, I love that. And somebody who also, like, I will say, one of the kindest people I've ever met, the smartest, but also the kindest. And I feel like those acts of kindness as teachers, the people who give them to us as they're teaching, teaching gifts, are just the most wonderful. Dr. Grant, how about for you? Who was transformative for you?
Well, I think about, again, representation matters. So when I was at UMass Boston, it feels like a long time ago now, the chancellor was Sherry Penny, and Sherry was the first woman in the country to lead a public research one institution. And it was just unheard of. And she also had to navigate through really challenging times. She was one of only a very few handful of women in that sector. And so Sherry was someone that I could just see doing this work of helping to think about how organizations can enable the work of the people within them. So Sherry was an important person in my life. We lost her a few years ago. And then someone who's just been a friend, a mentor, a guide to me, and probably most of the work I've done is someone named Hubie Jones. And Hubie was the dean of the BU School of Social Work. We worked together as colleagues at the McCormick Institute. And when I was considering embarking on kind of this crazy venture of thinking, about higher ed as a practice, Hubie was one who was encouraging of me to do that, and thinking a systems thinker, because I'm like Hubie, I got my start as a community organizer, social worker. And I think those skills come in pretty handy, the community organizing part anyhow, working within, the richness of higher education. So two people who really were transformative for me at some key moments, and Hubie still is. So.
I love that. How about for you, Sarah?
I would say, right off the top of my head, two women, Christine Clark and Jan Baum at the Oregon College of Art and Craft, because in general, I think that place gave me a sense, and those two people gave me a sense that ideas could really be worked out through materials and skill and alternative intelligences to, say, writing or language, or the things that we might, kind of foreground in other kinds of education. So that was critical. It's a real turning point for me, and I think it shapes so much about how I work and what I work in. But I will also say I had the opportunity to study. My mentor in graduate school was a metalsmith, blacksmith named Gary Griffin. He was the artist in residence at Cranbrook. And I think the thing that I really learned from Gary and really sticks with me, and it's part of, I think, my work now, is his mom was an antique dealer. And he was someone who really understood that expertise, history, connoisseurship, all those things could exist as deeply in someone who is a self-trained antique dealer as it could in a, Ivy League PhD art historian. And she was a businesswoman, and his respect for intelligence from all avenues of life, all avenues of application, all forms, was incredibly meaningful. So that made a big impression.
Awesome. Thank you. And Alison, how about you to round us out?
It is really hard to pick one person. I'll say Miss Ritter was my junior high art teacher. And during junior high, my dad passed away. I had joined as a private school as one of like 2 Black kids in a grade or class. Grade. They were small grades. So it was an isolating experience. And I had friends and all the things, but she, and my mom would, before my dad died, both my parents would just like leave me at school for long periods of time and kind of forget me. And then afterwards, after my dad passed away, my mom for sure just left me there. And so I would just be in her art studio space. And like the favorite part is like the closet with all the art supplies. And I could just draw and talk to her about the boy I had a crush on, every little tiny and large thing. And she just listened. There was like no judgment. And like art was my safe space. I like feel it saying this. She passed away, I think 2 years ago now. And so that was like the safe space that really helped fuel the like obsessive art practice. And then I'll just say quickly, and for all these people, it's like folks who saw you, slowed down and paid attention. Don Miller at RISD taught me bent lamination. And if y'all know my work, it's a lot of curved forms. And he treated me like a colleague in his investigation of the practice of like, how do we solve this problem? And I talk about creative problem solving. And then Clifton Monteith, who I went traveling after college. And everybody was like, how are you going to afford that? You don't have any money. What are you going to do? 7 months going where? Japan? What? And he was like, you should do it. And like, just like saw the like energy and excitement. And instead of like shooing that down, he is also that type of person. He like fueled it. He was like, I'm going to light the biggest fire and you go do your thing. So those are the people. I know it was one, but I gave you 3.
No, I love those. As I was writing down notes from all of the things that you all were saying, I was reminded when I went across the country, so many people call out their high school art teacher. Those are meaningful moments. And it strikes me, I didn't know that story, and I've known you for a while now, Alison. It strikes me that you have also now spent a significant part of your life working with teens in that moment in time. And so I love how the ways in which we have experienced teachers, of course, that comes back in the work that we now all do in the ways that we do it. The idea of mentorship running right throughout those stories, the idea of just thanking our teachers, which I really love, that as a practice, being able to say thank you to the people who've got us here. I think we all do that enough times, but it's nice to be reminded that that's a good place to be. We're in our last 5 minutes of the conversation. And so I'm going to do a quick fire round and just check in the chat because we have a really good brain trust here tonight. I want to make sure I haven't forgotten any questions that have come through. So if I do find one that's directed towards you, we're going to do it rapid fire this time around. But people are in the chat remembering their high school art teachers at Plymouth High School. Tanya Nixon-Silberg, I love that. Your mom is your inspiration for craft. Certainly my mom is an important teacher of mine too. We have folks talking about the difficulties of adjunct pay across colleges, talking about the fact it's not a problem that this panel can solve, but thinking again, Sarah, about that very important piece that you brought up about how we pay teachers, how we retain and reward the people who are doing the running of the schools, administering, teaching, doing all the things. Gary Roberts, hi Gary. Gary asks, when students are no longer enrolled, what helps to keep them local and working in our communities, making progress in their careers, in helping us make Boston? I'm wondering, Sarah, you're thinking about that a lot actually in that sort of circle of thinking about how students not only are in North Bennet, but also going out into communities too. And so I'm wondering if you have any immediate responses to what Gary is asking there about what helps to keep at least part of that magic when it's happening in school local somehow.
I mean, I guess because about half of our students come from outside of Boston, so I don't have anxiety necessarily that the skills stay in Boston as long as they stay somewhere, because all communities need these skills. So I'm less concerned about that, but I do take a lot of pride in the fact that we are unashamed, sort of unabashedly training for employment. And that's different than the context I've worked in before, where all the things that means, so that people can have a livelihood when they leave. I think that's critical. There's also been a great thread, I think Paulette Berger brought up, like all the ways that education can exist outside and mentorship can outside of formal schools. And I just say, like, stay tuned for Michelle's book, because it sounds like that's really what we're going to learn from you, Michelle, is like all the ways that mentorship and learning exist. So I just want to say, like, amen, amen, amen to Paulette Berger's comment.
Yes.
It's just, we're one piece, like higher education is one piece, but it's by no means the only place that it lives, thrives, exists, is valued, etc.
Yeah, and I see Paulette's question here. It's a great one. And I have to say, more than 50% of the answers I got to who is the teacher that brought you to your practice was a family member or community member, someone who had nothing to do with any kind of something that could be called a school. It was much more, I sat next to my grandmother, or I watched my mum do this, or my dad did this every weekend and I joined in, or a church member did it, or whatever the case was. And so that question about mentoring and teaching outside of formal systems of higher education is a great one. And I think it's something we all participate in, which then widens what craft means, right? Because it happens in so many places in so many ways. There are communities that Paulette talking about, that was the beginning to that question. I see Paulette, Marilyn Matis, thinking about this dichotomy about Sarah bringing up vocational education, fine arts education, thinking about the ways in which this connects also to the Boston public schools. Going back here to just making sure that we didn't miss any. There's a shout out with Rebecca. Frank, thank you very much to the Cut the Craft podcast with Rebel Awake. Thinking about that question that you raised, I think, Juliana, so beautifully. And then Alison also raised too, about whose histories are we hearing, whose histories are being taught, how do we make them resonate inside and outside of the places of learning. I'm going up. Okay, Karen. Oh, Karen, wonderful colleague of mine at the MFA, asking a question about special challenges facing craft schools in this post-COVID moment. That's a really big one. I'm wondering in the maybe a minute or two in terms of the ways in which each of these three schools that we've heard from tonight, how you are emerging back out into the world. Like, what is the thing again that's sort of keeping you up at night about how to meet this moment wherever we are in COVID? And Dr. Grant, I'm just going to pick on you.
Sure. Teaching during COVID. So I wasn't at the institution, but just hearing what faculty did to keep students engaged, sending kits home, all of those things, really remarkable. And now there's such energy on campus about wanting to be together, about returning to making collaboratively, about learning from one another. And so we are still, figuring out how we practice good public health, other things like that. But we're back, and the student spaces are filled with life and energy, but every single student has learned something from this time, has changed as a result of it. We have a really fabulous project that was done by one of our faculty members called Making Empathy, looking at the art making that took place during and throughout the pandemic and the time that we're in now, because we're not done yet, how we react to it, how we reflect, how we come together. So I think we're trying to incorporate what we've learned into being better and understanding the toll it took. How do we support one another? How do we support the mental health issues that have emerged? So there's a lot that we still have to go through, but the energy about being back, I think, is our superpower. And how do we strengthen community while caring for one another in ways that we really have to, because it's the toll it took on everybody is still with us. We're not done. We're not done.
I want to end, unless Alison, you want to add anything to that question.
I think that summarizes it really well, because there's just like the toll that the pandemic has taken. I think we all won't know for a long time. There's like the challenges currently of how do we fill teacher slots, right? Like those are very real challenges that I think people coming back to work or working differently in different pursuits, it's all kind of mixed up, our traditional processes of operating. So that's like what we're grappling with kind of on a like a practical level. I will say something that keeps coming to mind that I feel like I should say in this context is you're saying like, what keeps you up at night? This doesn't keep me up at night, but I know Dara's in the audience and she's our director of adult engagement and has really been challenging me. I'm a traditional woodworker, like it's a traditional, whatever that means, craft. Challenge me to like redefine what craft is as we engage audiences that have not historically came into our buildings. So when we think about like hair products and self-care products that are a craft, like taking care of things that in my mind, it's like, did that fit in my like college educated blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, how do we define that? So I think that belongs in this craft school conversation of like redefining and challenging some of our ideas of what the mediums are and who has access to those mediums in the past and currently, and how does craft show up inside someone's home on a daily basis. So
yeah, I love Richard Sennett for that, who tells us that craft, yes, can be something made out of clay, but it can also be parenting, it can be citizenship, it can be community organizing, and all the things. I'm going to end in the last minute that we have. Sarah, I asked you about the knotty things, but you also said, I have successes, and I want to be able to end with you telling us something that has made you really joyful about North Bennet Street over the last, I don't know, any of your tenure. Give us a success before we leave.
Well, I mean, I think someone asked about the pandemic, and I will say one thing I sort of appreciated during that time is it was a non-starter that we would go online with our education. We could not. And I loved that. I loved that was just not possible. Not to say we won't do online things in other ways. We absolutely do. We will. But there was a baseline where we had to be in person and we had to be with hands and tools and materials. And so the real success for me was the perseverance of the faculty and staff to do that. I mean, I know some of them are on the call, and I think like when the ones that were so tired doing all of that get to like step back and have our post-pandemic like reawakening. Not yet, we're all still working. And so just incredible gratitude to an amazing group of people that pushed through a very, very, very hard time.
Yeah. I love that as the way to end. I want to say a huge thank you to all of the truly fantastic speakers. Sarah, Dr. Grant, Alison, Juliana, thank you so much for being here this evening. Alison and Abigail, thank you for gathering us for this particular conversation, and to the Eliot School and Haystack, so very many thanks for being here. And thank you all to everybody in the audience for coming. The questions and the engagement were just fantastic. We could continue, but the lovely thing is many of us are in Boston, and so we do get to come to these brilliant schools, see each other and gather physically, as you were reminding us, Sarah, we can see each other in person. So I hope that we do get to do that. Thank you very much for being here this evening, and wishing everybody a really good night.